Welcome to Brain Wellness, the podcast. I'm your host, Mandy NP. Each episode will bring you a new topic or interview related to brain health and wellness as part of my mission to help you on the path to a healthier, happier brain. So, let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Brain Wellness, the podcast. My guest today is Dr. Brian Tierney. Dr. Tierney is a somatic psychologist, neuroscience professor, and psychotherapist with a passion for integrative healing. Specializing in trauma resolution, couples therapy, and integrative psychotherapy, he blends cutting-edge science with ancient practices to create transformative healing experiences. Thank you so much for being here with me today, Dr. Tierney.
Good to be here, Mandy.
Yeah, so we're going to have a lot of fun in this conversation, I think, today. But my first question for everyone is always just tell me a little bit about your story, kind of what brought you to where you are now.
Well, there's a lot of ways into that response, and this time I'll take the path of really articulating why I got so interested in neuroscience, because I'm a neuroscience professor now. And it's kind of weird in a way from a former body worker. So I was a massage therapist for many years, specializing in trauma resolution, in using, touch therapies and whatnot. So really it was my own suffering that brought me into the healing arts, which is the case for a lot of us. It was social anxiety for me. So I went into body work and massage therapy, and I started to, just get fascinated with craniosacral work. So I don't know if you're familiar with craniosacral therapy. Craniosacral therapy is really, I call it stillness touch now. But it's a non-invasive treatment that it's not like massage where people's clothes are off or anything like that. It's just like you touch the body, you put very little input into the brain and the nervous system. And it's great for the modern body because we're just so inundated with information. So I just found it so wonderful because it's not like a practitioner that's trying to do stuff and add information to process and all that. So I got fascinated with that work. I love the work, and I ended up teaching it. And in that modality, in the community that I was in, there's a lot of attention to the neuroscience of trauma. And I just geeked out. I was all in back in the kind of like early 2000s. Um, I got into Dan Siegel's work and the Norton series on interpersonal neurobiology, and I just love that stuff. I read half the Norton series, and now the Norton series is like over 80 volumes or something like that. So, it started with Alan Shore and Dan Siegel. Alan Shore was the founding editor, and I just went deeply into Alan Shore's work, fell in love with the science, and there was no going back for me. And so I ended up teaching internationally craniosacral work, but I really fell in love with the neuroscience. And now, like my book, which is with the editors now, goes on and on and on about trauma neuroscience. It's an update to trauma neuroscience, and fell in love with the cerebellum, and now actually next month, I'm going to be doing a brain dissection course.
Cool.
So it's like kind of weird for a psychotherapist, right, to be showing up at a brain dissection course.
Yeah, yeah, it's a little different, but I love how paths take you in different places. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
very cool. Um, yeah, I think I fell in love with neuroscience as soon as I got exposed to it as well. And I've never turned back. So 26 years in neuroscience myself. So yeah, just a few years. So what about the cerebellum fascinates you so much?
Well, let's see here. Clinically, what I started, so I got trained as an EMDR practitioner some years back. And, I had already obviously worked with many, many patients and clients in the trauma resolution field. And I had already been working with the eyes. Okay. In craniosacral therapy, everything is really, really slow. Okay, so the stillness touch is really, really slow. The tempo in the therapeutic environment is really slow, and everything is about slowing down. So it was a bit odd for me at the EMDR workshops, where things are like going like this. and like there was really great work being done, but in the back of my mind I was like, wait, hang on, there's this is just too fast, because clinically I had already been working with eyes, and I knew that um people that are really traumatized, they can get overwhelmed in the moment when they get triggered. And often one of the things that's happening is the eyes are going all over the place. They're unsequenced. Okay. So I didn't have a language for it at the time. I knew that Peter Levine, the big, somatic experiencing guy and everything, he talks a lot about working with the eyes and knew a little bit about brain spotting. But I really didn't have a neuroscientific language. And well, there's a neuroscientific language in EMDR, you know, that kind of is mainly about the amygdala, reducing activity in the amygdala. But I thought there's got to be something more. And after thorough research, I found out that, it's really the cerebellum that has to be activated during trauma resolution practices. And if it's not activated, the trauma resolution process is not as efficient and effective. So that was really, really what got me, because, the cerebellum is the area that it does many, many things. And we can talk about that and drill down into what the cerebellum, how it functions. But the key word here is sequencing. Okay. See, I think I say the word sequencing something like 400 times in my book. Um, because what it does, when I'm talking about the eyes and they're all over the place in trauma, they are unsequenced. Okay. And so the penny just dropped for me with the cerebellum. I'm like, wow, it's all about sequencing. It's all about sequencing. Like you trip over a log or whatever, and the cerebellum has to project and predict the sequencing of coming back into the gate. And so I really, with the neuroscience saying the cerebellum has to be lit up during trauma resolution processes. If not, it's not going to be effective. And then I just started to get this sequencing language. And once I had that lens on, my work just, skyrocketed into being much more efficient, to the point where, I'll treat somebody, that has a trauma of some kind. It'll be one session and done.
Hmm.
It's quite amazing. Once you have the cerebellar lens, you start to see, all sorts of even social phenomenon, because so for so many years, the cerebellum was thought of as this hub for motor sequencing.
Mhm.
So like the fine tuning, just like I said, like the tripping over a log, that stuff was known for so long. But over the last 10, 15, 20 years, it's been, the cognitive cerebellum has come into light as being, a real area of the cerebellum where it's doing all sorts of cognitive stuff and all sorts of social stuff. And there's even a limbic hub in the cerebellum. So it's like there's really a blast of cerebellar research in terms of its complexity and how advanced it is evolutionarily.
Yeah, I don't think I even knew as deep of the role of in that whole sequencing process, because I've always known that, the cerebellum is the bottom part of your brain. That's where your balance is, your coordination. And that's about really as deep as I ever got with I used to deal with stroke patients a lot. So if they had a stroke in the cerebellum, they always had balance coordination issues. But I don't think I ever thought about it as that whole sequencing part you just described. So that's a whole different way to look at it.
It involves speech sequencing, so people can get strokes and then their speech will get all messed up. I forget the technical term for that, because there's so many technical terms jammed into my brain.
Yeah.
But there's a technical term. A speech therapist would most definitely know this, that if you get a stroke in a particular region of the cerebellum, you won't be able to tell a narrative. So the cerebellum also has to do with narrative sequencing, which has, I mean, the implications are vast for, autism spectrum disorders.
Mm.
But if you think about it, right, if we're, for example, in a conflict or something, and when we're in conflict, it can be very difficult to put together coherent sentences. Or if we're really nervous or something like that. Like when I'm early public speaking, I'd get up and I'd be like, and the narrative just couldn't be sequenced. Now, there's a lot in the neuroscience literature and the interpersonal neurobiology literature about the top of the brain. It really it's like an executive model. Literally, they call it the executive control center, and which I don't like. It's like it's a capitalism. It's like there's dudes in suits or something like that at the top of the brain, at the top of the hierarchy. And it's still very much in the literature that the pinnacle of evolution is here in the neocortex, the orbitofrontal cortex and whatnot. But when you look at the cerebellum, it's not true. It's a subcortical structure. It's ancient as hell, but it's very, very advanced. So, like if you compare with a macaque monkey, cerebellum is only 33% of the brain in terms of volume. But in the human, it's like 85% of the entire brain volume because it's so densely packed. It's got something like 85 billion neurons or something like that. So it is evolutionarily advanced. It is doing stuff that is very, very complex. It's doing social sequencing. So like imagine the moment, like a traumatic moment when so and so walks in through the door, the abuser walks in through the door, and they walk in through a very specific angle. And let's say I'm having an emotion or something like that. Let's say it's joy. Let's say I'm like expressing expansive joy. And then the abuser comes in and a particular sequence happens. Okay. So let's say that the abuser clamps down like this and gets into a like a kind of attacking posture and then comes in through that particular angle towards me. And then I get into a clamp down process as well. And then the abuse happens. Now that whole sequence, now again, this is why I'm so much about sequencing. That whole sequence gets encoded by the cerebellum in collaboration with the rest of the brain, with the hippocampi and stuff like that, memory systems, and all that information gets uploaded into the default mode network. Now, so the cerebellum has been proven to be a central part of the default mode network. That required a deep dive into the literature for me. So we can qualify default mode network. I'm sure you talk about it, know about it. And we could talk about the implications about that. But where the rubber hits the road is the sequencing process. So in trauma, what we're doing is we need knowing about the cerebellum really helps to inform the resolution of the trauma because you have that lens of sequencing, and we need to go kind of frame by frame because that's what the cerebellum does with the eye movements.
Mhm.
It takes these rapid frames or constantly twitching the eyes are. And the cerebellum has to put all of that visual information, visual data into sequence so that we see a coherent flow of visual data. But with trauma, right, it gets all unsequenced. So we have to go frame by frame and resequence the whole thing. After that's done, that person is going to be less likely to be thrown into an unsequenced, unregulated, dysregulated state.
Yeah. And I've heard of the default mode network, and I do want to get into that, but I want to make one quick comment on that first. So I had gotten in a car accident a couple of years ago, had some really bad PTSD. I went through EMDR, and it's funny that you mentioned that whole speed thing with the eyes a little bit ago too, because we actually couldn't start with the lights. We had to just do bilateral tapping because the lights were way too much for the eye problems that I had following my accident. But that helps to explain why some of those things work with EMDR also, just because everything is kind of out there. And when you're going through that whole process, you are kind of breaking it down and putting it back into a sequence without even realizing it. Because as you just described that, it made so much more sense of why my EMDR worked.
Mhm.
Yeah, like I said, I've heard about the default mode network, and I'm pretty sure that I don't know it to the same level that you're going to describe it now, because the way you're describing things is just so much more than I've heard in 26 years of working in neuroscience. So,
Yeah, so default mode network, the discovery of it, that's the man's name is Marcus Rakel. He's just this lovely kind of like grandpa guy. I don't know if he's still alive. Pretty sure he's still alive. But I've seen videos of the guy and he's just got this lovely grandpa energy. And you just kind of want to sit next to him and have him tell you a story. He's just such a cool guy. So I like that in neuroscience when I run into somebody that's just like got that good vibe. Yak Panksepp was like that too. He's one of my favorite affective emotional neuroscientists. So anyways, he's the one that discovered that, hey, the brain is like always active. And so what is it doing kind of at rest when we're not on task? So when we're on task, when we're doing stuff like we're doing right now, okay, we're in a whole region of the brain, a whole network of neurons lights up when we're on task. When we're not on task, what he discovered is that a whole another region of the brain lights up, a whole mega system of neurons. And really, so and that's the default mode network. So when we're kind of daydreaming, when we're in line at checkout, when, like, for example, in people that have anxiety disorders, when they're thinking about themselves a lot and that sort of thought looping thing, and these days spiraling is a really popular term. I was spiraling. That is hyperactivation of the default mode network. So that the brain is never at rest. The default mode network lights up during dreaming. So the brain is really active during dreaming as well, and default mode network is active during dreaming. But really, the way that I like to teach students about the default mode network in terms of function is that it's I call it the memory superhighway. So the hippocampy, the way I like to explain it is the hippocampus is where the hippos go to school. That's my tongue-in-cheek kind of like, that's where the hippos go to school because it's essential to memory consolidation, memory formation. The way that I like to describe it is that the hippocampy upload memories during sleep into the default mode network, which is the memory superhighway. And really now it's kind of understood in the literature as our best neural correlate for the ego. Okay, so self-referential thinking, the brain can really be understood as a predictive simulation organ. So like predicting futures, projecting futures, and that's what the default mode network does. It's a mental time travel machine.
Mhm.
So it's looking back into the past, projecting into the future. When I say, hey, think of a time when you were 5 years old, boom, default mode network is going. So your meaning making processes, which are habitual, okay, are very much about the default mode network. Those habits of meaning making, they get set in. Default mode network is functional and totally online by about the age 12. Okay. About the age of 12, it's like think about it as our meaning making apparatus, our autobiographical superhighway. But really, it's kind of like the best we have in neuroscience these days to represent what the ego is in classical psychoanalysis.
Hmm. So that makes sense when you mention the spiraling. If people are kind of getting into this downward spiral and ruminating over things, that is that whole self-examination process that's happening over and over and over again.
Yep. And what will happen is if that is hyperactivated, it will intrude on the task network. So this is really a paradigm shift in neuroscience
Mhm.
into what's now called network neuroscience. And so these two systems, the task network and the default mode network, those were like the original auguring or the original entry point into this paradigm shift. So the default mode network and people that are self-referential or traumatized will intrude upon the task network. So like if we're fisher people and we're out on a boat in Alaska or something like that, and we're working with nets and hooks and stuff like that, you do not want the default mode network to intrude upon those tasks. Like I should say Minnesota instead of Alaska. Like we're on Lake Superior or something like that, and we're working with hooks. You do not want to be caught in a self-referential loop because one of those hooks is going in your finger.
Yeah. Yeah. So it feels like those things happen more often now. Is it just that we're talking about it more, or is it actually something that we see more in society, do you think?
You mean the intrusions,
Yeah.
like intrusions upon tasks? Well, I think it's because we're just so inundated by information. It's too much to sequence. This brings us back to the cerebellum. There's just I mean, our task flows are insane.
Mhm.
There's just so much info. We're inundated by information. It's too much to sequence. And when things are unsequenced, then it's harder to be on task. It's just, and everything is gauged nowadays to capture your attention for that golden, I don't know, what is it, 5, 6 seconds? Or, I mean, you're a podcaster, right? You got to like capture the attention in the first 5 seconds. And if you don't get it, then it's like you're lost and you don't get your followers. But I mean, gosh, it's like we're getting tugged in all of these directions to, everybody's vying to capture the attention. That's an interesting term, right?
Hmm.
Capture.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, we used to be hunter-gatherers. Now we're just hunting for information that will catch our attention.
Oh, you said it. It's like music to my ears. Yeah,
Mhm.
hunter-gatherers, right? Because the deep dive into cerebellar research, there's always pretty much an encounter with stone napping. So stone napping, and this is the work of Dietrich Stout. Dietrich Stout, look into this guy. He's really, really cool. What he does is he has graduate students in an MRI. He teaches them how to do stone napping. And one of the weirdest things about stone napping, so these ancient hand axes are like 2 million years old. And it takes modern graduate level students 300 hours to learn how to do it.
Wow.
300 hours. Okay. And that's with mentorship. And it's like, so what Dietrich is saying is that 2 million years ago, our forebears had to have mentors. Because otherwise you can't learn this stuff. It's really a technology. And it's a technology of sequencing is the thing. You need to hold up this stone and you need to do precise naps on the stone with very, very the mind needs to learn how to project a future. It needs to learn how to simulate a future and with a significant amount of detail in terms of how you rotate the stone and the trajectory and the vector of how you hit it, and whether it's another stone, I think it's called a flint, or a core. I think I can't remember the terminology, or a bone.
Mhm.
Okay, and then one of the cases for that is that wow, we needed to have an advanced cerebellum to do that predictive sequencing. So predictive sequencing is really where it's at. And how does it plug into the default mode network? Well, this was part of, the mutation process of acquiring language, because
Mhm.
language is obviously complex sequencing. You
Mhm.
know what I mean?
Mhm.
So you have to learn it on a motor level and learn how to do the simulation before you can acquire language. And so that predictive sequencing, started a long, long time ago with our forebears napping stone.
Yeah. So as a psychologist, then how do you tap into that knowledge to make it work in someone's benefit?
Well, it's most obvious in trauma resolution work because I'm sure, well, I'm not sure, but I'd bet on it that when you got in your accident, time slowed down.
Mhm.
Okay, just extraordinarily common, this piece, right?
Mhm.
So, time is in fact flexible, and the way that the brain experiences time dilates and compresses. And the reason why it dilates and compresses is because the brain has to process many, many sequences when it's in danger. Okay, many, many frames. Better to say frames.
Mhm.
Many, many frames of information. So it's like snapshot because it doesn't want this stuff to happen again, or if it does, it wants to be prepared for it. So it takes a lot of frames of information. But because we've been so conditioned as a species away from our kind of animal instincts, that overload of information isn't processed naturally by the brain and the body anymore. So with other animals, if they get traumatized, they'll just go through a convulsive set of I should say convulsive sequence of tremors, okay, where their body is tremoring and they shake off the trauma after something intense has happened and basically like reset the brain so that it can come back into sequence. Very similar to like we trip over a log and then the brain has to go like this and then come back into its, they're called central pattern generators in the nervous system, come back into this very deep ancient gate pattern. So when a trauma happens, our animal body is wired to go into convulsive sequencing to shake it off. But because that's been essentially conditioned out of us, because that looks weird and insane, we don't do that anymore. So people are just carrying around held trauma. So knowing the sequencing language helps me to go in again and go frame by frame and kind of unpack the information that is compressed in there, kind of get into the zip folder because that information that hasn't been processed and it just kind of accumulates information over time as the trauma gets repeated and repeated because trauma projects itself into the present. And then so we have another instance of the bad thing that happened, and then another instance, and then another instance, and then another instance, and that gets compressed in these frames. And then so having this cerebellum knowledge helps to inform, you know, how I get into the frame, how a scene is constructed to get into the actual memory file folder. And that's a whole, we could talk about the precuneus if we get there, because that's another region of interest in the brain. That has to do a lot with scene construction and third person perspective. It's part of the default mode network. But so once I'm in the file folder, there's very specific sequences in there that are unresolved. So I don't know if I was working with you. What am I looking for? I'm looking for what is the specific vector of impact of the other car, because the brain knows that. The brain remembers that. The brain is very, very specific about spatial dynamics. The abuser came in from that direction. The car came in from that direction. And if it's not resolved, the body is going to be replaying the defensive sequence. And over time, it kind of compresses itself and gets rooted in the structure of the body because it's practiced over and over and over and over again, that sequence. So we need to get in there and figure out what the body needed to do that it couldn't do. So, like, for example, I worked with a car accident. Do I want to say victim? Car accident? No, maybe not victim. What do you call it? Car accident person?
Yeah. I
Person,
say survivor sometimes because it was a pretty
car
big
accident.
injury.
Yeah,
Yeah.
car accident survivor. They got in an accident like in the mountains or something like that at something like 75, 80 miles per hour. They fell asleep. The car rolled over and he was stuck upside down in the car on his seatbelt with like broken shoulder girdle and stuff like that. And what we needed to do over a series of sessions is we needed to process frame by frame what happened. And because I have this cerebellar knowledge, I'm really, really interested in what the body needed to do, what information is stored, and a lot of it is emotional information. And when you get in there, what you find is that the nervous system will speed up and try to jump to the next frame and skip over the emotional information because it's too intense. And culture kind of supports that, right? Because we don't have much tolerance for intense emotion.
Mhm.
So then there's a skipping, and then there's a lot in my work. There's a lot of rewinding processes because it's like, okay, you just jumped over a frame in the sequence, and if I didn't have knowledge about the cerebellum, because there's a split in the literature versus practice. There's really sophisticated trauma resolution practices, but the neuroscience is behind. So my hope is to kind of update it and bring in the cerebellum as an essential structure and learning how to do this rewind work and really get clear about what the brain is doing in these moments.
Mhm. Do you do this by talking through the episode then, or how do you gain access to that?
Yeah. So the way that I do it is I'm a unique psychotherapist in the sense that a lot of times I'm using touch, stillness touch therapy.
Yeah.
Don't call it craniosacral anymore because if you go to, Wikipedia or something like that and you read craniosacral, it's like, oh, that's bad. So,
Mm.
so it's a trauma informed touch, stillness touch, non-doing touch, and it really helps to activate. Hope this isn't too much jargon. The C tactile fibers in the body. Okay, C tactile fibers are little neurons that register touch that's often experienced as safe. It's slow touch. It's touch that is in the same neighborhood as a mother caressing a child at a slow tempo. Okay. And it registers in the insula in the deep region of the brain that's reading out the sensory information. It's registering as, this is soothing. So it's for most people, touch is down regulating. For most people, touch helps to bring things down. And of course, I'm in the intake, I'm like, we're at each moment we're doing consent and I'm making sure that touch is going to be, but most people, I have my hand on their autonomic, plexi, the hubs in the autonomic system that, where there's just so much information, in terms of the gas and the brake, heart rate going up, heart rate going down, all that stuff. So often it's on the abdomen where there's so many neurons there, and I'm just providing a soothing touch for that. And then we're just doing regression. I take them into a creative visualization of some kind or something to get their body in a relaxed state. Their eyes are closed. I'm telling you, being horizontal with your eyes closed, I mean, it can be intense because the practitioner, especially with, people that really are, that have been abused or something. But for most people, being horizontal and having the eyes closed is really soothing because we're inundated with information and faces and it's intense to have to be looking at a face
Hmm.
and to have your face be seen.
Hmm.
So I just reduce information, reduce noise, reduce information, reduce noise, and then we go into the traumatic memory. And we go into the traumatic memory through scene construction, very detailed scene construction, and sometimes I bring in tactile tappers. So that's kind of EMDR adjacent, but I don't need them because, as I've said before, sometimes that pacing is just too quick for some people.
Hmm.
And then we're just getting into the traumatic memory frame by frame through visualization. So, in my research, it's very, very clear that mental imagery is very, very powerful for the brain. A lot of regions of the brain don't care if you're visualizing. Now, granted, the visualization has to be done well, and
Hmm.
this is why I've studied the precuneus because you have to be in the spatial registers of the brain. You have to be in the vestibular system. So knowing that stuff helps me to really clearly set the scene to do effective trauma work.
Yeah. So does it work if somebody if somebody doesn't remember the trauma or they've blocked it out? Because you have to be able to work through it, right?
Yep. It does. It
Okay.
does. And how does it work? Because the trauma will show up in the repetitive patterning, the gestures, the posture of a person.
Okay.
Okay. So if a person is genuinely traumatized, what's going to happen is eventually, clinically, that stuff in the past is going to intrude into the task of the present. What's the task? We're talking about stuff.
Hmm.
What's the task? We're doing narratives. We're making meaning. Where a lot of people in psychotherapy want it to be so functional and evidence-based and like what is it, a brief psychotherapy where it's 8 sessions or whatever. So I want to get my model. I want to get my thing that I can do in 5 steps to get better from anxiety and all that stuff is decent. But if they're traumatized, no, 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 no. Those tasks of learning the stuff that you should be learning or whatever, okay, will get intruded upon eventually by the past, by these compressed sequences of too much information that the brain and the cerebellum can't put into order, and boom, it's in the room. Boom, it's in the room. And then it shows up in specific ways, very specific ways for individual bodies. And again, because it's a replay, it's very, very spatial. If you think about it, a trauma it has a GPS time and date stamp
Mhm.
and location stamp. It's very, very specific. I mean, it's like, come on, it's not trauma isn't conceptual, it's very, very concrete. So the body will be replaying that spatial situation. The abuser came in from this angle, or let's say it's a public shaming thing that happened, like when I was in Minnesota in my teens, like I was on a Lutheran ski camp tour or something like that, and we were on a 17-hour bus ride, and I kissed my girlfriend, and like the priest found out about it and publicly shamed me in front of the whole bus of people in the middle of the night when everybody was sort of groggy, woke everybody up. It's like in the middle of the night, a
Oh my gosh.
17-hour bus ride. Woke everybody up, lights go on, and then proceeded to publicly shame me and bring me the fire of God.
Oh my gosh.
So again, this is a specific sequence that's
Yeah.
spatially situated. I'm in a specific location in the bus, okay? And my body is doing specific things,
Hmm.
and like that. And then the light comes on from that direction, and then there's the voice that's coming from a very specific, there's a physics to this stuff. Okay, it's not just pie in the sky. The brain is very concrete. Even if we're doing a math equation, the cerebellum is lit up like we're rotating that ancient hand axe. It treats complex abstract stuff like, you know, very concrete stuff. That's how the brain works. Nothing is abstract in the brain.
Hmm. Hmm. Do you find that this works more effectively than regular EMDR?
I think so. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I could try. I mean, I threw out the original EMDR protocols long ago
Mm.
because I had been a neuroscience informed trauma resolution practitioner for so long
Mhm.
that I knew immediately the limitations of going so quickly.
Mhm.
And that's just not gonna, it's not a one size fits all. And they need to have the protocols because they need to have that evidence-based model, and they need to get the research and the funding and all of that stuff. But it's most definitely not a one
Mhm.
size fits all.
Mhm.
People need different things.
Yeah.
And that requires a really detailed understanding of how the brain is processing information in different ways with different people at different times.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, it's definitely not a one size fits all. Trauma's not one size fits all. No traumas are the same. And if they were all the same, if there was all one reason, then we wouldn't have all these different ways to treat it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And
So do you want, yeah,
one thing I
go
always tell
ahead. No,
people
keep going.
is if you're not getting the answer, if you're not getting the result that you're looking for, look somewhere else because something else might work for you or someone else might work for you where the things you've tried in the past have not.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So maybe we have a time for another topic, and maybe we could choose our own adventure here. Would you like to talk about the precuneus or how the
Yeah,
cerebellum is involved in
we've got a couple minutes. You take your pick. Surprise me.
the precuneus? I'll give you the choice: the precuneus, or how the cerebellum is involved in autism.
Ooh, I'm curious about the precuneus too, but I have a son that's got autism, so I'm
Okay.
personally have a little connection with that one. So let's take that one.
Okay. Okay. So there's a fancy phrase, a fancy concept called developmental diaschisis. Okay. Schisis just means to cut. And in this model, it's been shown that the cerebellum is radically implicated in autism spectrum disorders. Okay. And the statistics are out of this world. So if a person has genetic elements or viral elements, or um, an embryological missed developmental step in the cerebellum, a person is 40 times more likely to develop an autism spectrum disorder. 40 times. Okay. So we know, and the literature is very, very clear that the cerebellum is implicated deeply in autism spectrum disorders. And so what the developmental diaschizis thing tells us is that the earlier that there's damage to the cerebellum or genetic or viral elements in utero,
Mhm.
that person will very likely, the earlier that it is, the more likely that there's going to be an autism phenotype.
Interesting.
So it tells us some really interesting things about early intervention.
Mhm.
I'm hoping that occupational therapists can be informed by the latest in cerebellar research because it very much informs early intervention strategies. And what does that look like? A focus on sequencing. Is it just motor sequencing? No, no, no. But that surely helps if you help a person to fine tune their motor sequencing, just like how you rotate objects or whatever at a very detailed rate, that
Mhm.
can help and to develop the cerebellum. But with the latest research in the cerebellum, the framework is really like, well, you can really make sense of autism spectrum disorders as a problem in sequencing. And so if you put on that lens, you start to see how narrative sequencing on a continuum, because it's a wide spectrum, has varying levels of disjunction in terms of how the person is using expressive language. You know what I mean? Receptive language, how they're putting together meaning-making processes, theory of mind, this sequence of how another person and uses their facial cues and verbal cues and so on, how the person is sequencing those cues to get a map of the other person's meaning making process and mind and stuff like that. So it really, really starts to make sense once you have the lens on and you work, because I work with folks on the spectrum,
Mhm.
and by golly, I'm doing sequencing. I am doing sequencing. I am helping them to refine their sequencing. I'm helping them to do narrative sequencing,
Mhm.
uh, motor sequencing, and so on. And it's a game changer.
Mhm. It's interesting to think of it that way too, because so my son, like many others that are on the spectrum, he gets very regimented and he likes his pattern of things to do. And if something disrupts that pattern, it's very disruptive continually because then what do you do next? Because that pattern has been broken. But at the same time, when you were talking before about having to learn the sequencing for even the rock work, if when how do I say that? When he's having a disruption with somebody, he can't see the steps forward that lead to the consequences.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
there's a problem with sequencing kind of all over the place. He
Yeah.
likes that sequence, he likes that
Yeah.
regimented structure, but at the same time, can't see what's coming up.
Yep. That's the predictive simulation stuff.
Yeah.
That's the predictive sequencing. And the cerebellum is very much a part of that, as part of the default mode network. The default mode network, is really a predictive simulation device. But you're exactly right. That's the other side of it, the kind of rigid sequencing
Mhm.
that gets a person locked in and unable to project contingencies, different possibilities, different pathways in the future. And yep, that's sequencing too, right? And so how to introduce flexibility in the current task, because that's a
Mhm.
task network, right?
Yep.
So in a way, it's like it's difficult for some people to get into the default mode network. That's the other side of it. Sometimes you do want a little bit of daydreaming, a little bit of flexibility when you're in a task to kind of come up with contingencies. And like flow states is a perfect example of that. Sometimes you're on a task, like running or in the flow with research or something like that. And that's really when the brain is weirdly freed up to go to the next level.
Mhm. Mm. You're making me think on a whole different level today, and I love it because I love when I get challenged to think about things differently. I would love to ask you so many more questions, but I think for the sake of time, at least, let's kind of start wrapping up a little bit. I know you've got your book coming up. Any other events or projects that you would like to share with our listeners?
Well, I'm going to be producing more video content that's kind of like presentation level content. So like an hour long lectures and stuff like that. I should get out of saying lectures and say, be more marketing friendly. What are we supposed to say instead of lectures?
Like webinars, I think, or something is better,
Webinars. Yeah.
more
Webinars.
attractive now.
Be on the lookout for that stuff. And so my Instagram is hashtag the somatic doctor. So there'll be more and more long form content there. And other long form content is like my podcast called The Boundless Body. And it's like, I think that's hashtag Boundless Body Pod or something like that. Yeah. So be on the lookout for
Cool.
that stuff. Or I'm doing free consultations as well. So if you're interested in this stuff, you can go to my website, the Somatic Doctor, or I'm sorry, somaticdoctor.com, and sign up for a free consultation. We could talk brain talk, or if you have a child with autism or something, we can talk about some strategies.
Very cool. Very cool. And I will include all of those social media links in our show notes as well, too, so people can find all of those. Any last bits of words of wisdom that you'd like to share as we wrap up today?
Well, I'm a big advocate for laughter, you know. So I just like to end with that. Like see if you can get yourself more engaged in play sequences. Okay. And play sequences start with play bids, like a dog wagging its tail and putting down its snout,
Mhm.
you know. So be on the lookout for play bids. It's the beginning, it's the invitation into the beginning of a play sequence. Be on the lookout for play bids. It's not, I mean, obviously we're not wagging our tails, but we have our versions of kind of like play bids.
Mhm.
So look for those play bids and take them more often and just explore with play sequences because it's really healthy for the brain and healthy for the soul.
Mhm. I love that. That's a great way to end our show today. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Tierney.
Good to see you, Mandy.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Take care.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Brain Wellness, the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to subscribe, like, and share this with others to help me continue on with my mission to help people live healthier, happier lives. Go to www.brainwellnesssolutions.com to see what I'm up to and get links to all the social medias there. See you next time.